Hello there, friends and families. Tonight, I've got a special story to share, one that's close to my heart. You see, my youngest daughter absolutely adores this true tale from history about a stubborn mule who ended up teaching a doubting merchant a lesson in faith. This is one of her favorite stories, so I thought, why not bring it to life in a fun, family-friendly way for all of you? Gather round, because this is the amazing story of the mule who chose God over oats and changed everything. And the town of Padua, a wealthy merchant made the biggest mistake of his life. He challenged a saint to prove God exists using a hungry mule. What happened next shocked everyone, including the mule, who honestly just wanted breakfast and had no idea he was about to become the most famous donkey in Italy. Now, you might be wondering how a mule ends up in a theological debate. Well, let me tell you, it all started with a sneeze. Not just any sneeze, mind you, but the kind of earth-shaking, bird-scattering, did someone just fire a cannon sneeze that only a mule can produce at dawn when the whole world is trying to sleep in. Achoo! The mule, let's call him Brother Mule, though he hadn't earned that title yet, stood in the marketplace of Padua, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. He was the color of toasted chestnuts, with a white patch on his forehead that looked like someone had accidentally spilled paint while trying to give him a blessing. His ears rotated like satellite dishes whenever someone mentioned food within a 3-block radius, which in a town full of bakers was pretty much constantly. "That beast of yours has no manners, Bartolomeo," called out old Giuseppe the fishmonger, wiping scales from his hands. Sir Bartolomeo di Veriano, and yes, that's his full name, because rich people back then collected names like some people collect stamps, straightened his silk cloak and tried to look dignified. This was challenging, since his mule had just chewed a hole in said cloak the size of a dinner plate. "At least my mule doesn't steal fish when no one's looking," Bartolomeo shot back, which was unfair because the mule had only done that twice, and Giuseppe's fish had been asking for it by smelling so delicious. "Hold on there, you four-legged vacuum cleaner," Pietro, the stable boy, said with a grin, gently tugging the rope. The mule gave him a look that clearly said, "You have betrayed our friendship, and I shall remember this when I write my memoirs." That's when the trouble started. A small crowd had gathered, as crowds do when there's entertainment that doesn't cost money. Children sat cross-legged in the front row like they were at the world's most rustic theater. Mothers kept one eye on their kids and another on their purses. Fathers tried to look like they had important business elsewhere, but somehow never left. And there, walking through the square with the kind of calm confidence that makes nervous people even more anxious, came Saint Anthony of Padua himself. Now, Anthony wasn't called a saint yet. That paperwork would come later, but everyone in town knew he was special. Children ran to him like he was made of candy. Mothers asked him advice like he was their wise older brother. And even the town's stray cats seemed to purr louder when he passed by. "Good morning, Father Anthony," called little Lucia, a girl with enormous eyes and pigtails that defied gravity. "Good morning, little one, and good morning to you too, Brother Mule." The mule, hearing himself addressed so respectfully, straightened up and tried to look noble. This lasted exactly 3 seconds before he spotted a dropped apple and immediately forgot about dignity in favor of breakfast. "Brother Mule," says Ser Bartolomeo, but it wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that makes servers in restaurants extra careful not to spill soup. "Father, with all respect, that creature is no more brother to anyone than this bread is the body of Christ." The square went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, like when everyone's listening to a beautiful song, but the awkward kind, like when someone mentions politics at a dinner party. Anthony's face didn't change, but something in his eyes got very still and very deep. "Interesting comparison, Sir Bartolomeo. Tell me, what do you see when you look at the host during Mass?" "Bread," Bartolomeo said flatly. "Perfectly ordinary bread dressed up in fancy ceremonies to fool simple minds into thinking they're eating something divine. It's theater, Father. Expensive theater." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people crossed themselves. Others shifted uncomfortably. The mule, oblivious to the theological implications, successfully retrieved the apple and began crunching it with the satisfaction of someone who has accomplished their life's mission. "I see," Anthony said quietly. "And what would convince you otherwise?" Oh, this was where Sir Bartolomeo made his big mistake. You see, there are some questions that seem like traps but aren't. And there are some questions that seem perfectly innocent but are actually giant bear traps disguised as daisies. This was definitely the second kind. Bartolomeo's eyes lit up with the gleam of someone who thinks they've just won an argument. "Simple, Father. If your host is truly the body of Christ, then even animals should recognize it, shouldn't they? Animals aren't fooled by human superstitions. They know food when they see it." "Go on," Anthony said, and something in his voice should have been a warning sign, like those rumbles you hear before an avalanche. "3 days," Bartolomeo announced, his voice carrying across the square like a town crier. "I'll starve my mule for 3 days. Then we'll bring him here to the square. On one side, I'll place fresh oats, and I mean the good stuff, not the cheap grain. On the other side, you can hold up your precious host. If the mule chooses your bread over my oats, I'll kneel right here in front of everyone and admit I was wrong." The crowd gasped. Someone's baby started crying, probably from the tension. The mule looked up from his apple with interest. He was pretty sure he'd heard the word oats, which was one of his favorite words in any language. "And if he chooses the oats?" Anthony asked. Bartolomeo grinned like a cat who'd found a canary convention. "Then this whole town admits it's been worshiping breadcrumbs, and you can stop filling people's heads with fairy tales." Now, here's where you might expect Anthony to back down, or maybe suggest they flip a coin instead, or perhaps point out that putting God to the test is generally frowned upon in most theological circles. But Anthony just stood there looking at the mule, who was now trying to determine if apple cores were worth the effort or if he should hold out for something better. "Brother Mule," Anthony said softly, and the mule's ears swiveled toward him like furry radar dishes. "What do you think? Are you up for a little theological experiment?" The mule, being a mule, had opinions about everything but rarely shared them verbally. This time, however, he seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He lifted his head, looked directly at Anthony, and let out a bray that somehow managed to sound both dignified and slightly sarcastic, as if to say, "Well, this should be interesting, but I hope someone's taking notes because I'm not repeating myself." The crowd laughed, breaking the tension like a well-timed joke in a serious movie. Anthony nodded slowly. "Very well, Sir Bartolomeo, I accept your challenge. But know this, you're not just testing the mule's appetite, you're wagering against love itself. And love," he paused, looking at the mule, who was now attempting to eat his own rope out of what appeared to be nervous energy, "love has a sense of humor." As if to prove the point, the mule at that exact moment managed to get his rope tangled around his own legs, creating a situation that required 3 people and considerable diplomatic negotiation to resolve. The crowd burst into laughter, and even Bartolomeo cracked a smile. "3 days, then," Bartolomeo said, extending his hand. "May the best, well, may the truth win." Anthony shook his hand. "The truth always does, my friend. Sometimes it just takes a while to untangle itself." The mule, finally free of his rope predicament, celebrated by attempting to eat Bartolomeo's hat, which led to another round of laughter and the discovery that expensive silk apparently tastes like disappointment with hints of regret. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they'd just witnessed, Anthony remained in the square for a moment, watching the mule who would soon become the most famous theological consultant in Italy. "Well, Brother Mule," he said quietly, "I hope you know what you've gotten us into." The mule looked at him with those large, thoughtful eyes that seemed to say, "Father, I haven't had a proper meal in an hour. I've been volunteered for a religious experiment I don't understand, and someone just tried to make me eat rope. But if you think this is God's plan, then I suppose we'd better make the best of it. Just maybe keep some extra oats handy in case divine intervention runs late." And so began the strangest 3 days in the history of Padua, involving one hungry mule, one stubborn merchant, one gentle saint, and enough theological drama to keep the town talking for generations. But that's just the beginning of our story, because over the next 3 days, that mule was about to teach an entire town about faith, humility, and the surprising wisdom that can come from a creature whose main concerns in life are food, shelter, and finding the perfect spot for an afternoon nap. What do you think happened next? Can you imagine trying to explain to a mule that he's about to participate in a miracle? And more importantly, have you ever been so hungry that you'd consider eating rope? Well, you're about to find out what happens when divine providence meets stubborn hunger, when pride goes head to head with grace, and when the fate of a town's faith rests in the hooves of one very confused but very faithful mule. Day one of what would become known as the Great Mule Fast of Padua dawned with all the drama of a Tuesday morning, which is to say, not much drama at all, unless you were the mule. Our 4-legged friend woke up, stretched in that particular way mules do, like they're auditioning for a yoga class but don't want to seem too eager, and trotted over to his feed trough with the confidence of someone who has never missed breakfast in his entire life. The trough was empty. The mule stared at it. He blinked. He looked around to see if perhaps the trough had moved during the night, or if this was some sort of optical illusion. Then he did what any reasonable creature would do in such circumstances. He stuck his entire head into the empty trough just to make absolutely certain there wasn't a single oat hiding in the corners. Nothing. Pietro, the stable boy, watched from nearby with the guilty expression of someone who's just told a child that Santa Claus is on vacation. "Sorry, friend," he whispered. "Master's orders. No food for 3 days." The mule lifted his head and gave Pietro a look that could have curdled milk. It was a look that said, "Pietro, my boy, we have been friends. I have never bitten you, even when you forgot to clean my hooves properly. I have carried your burdens without complaint. And this is how you repay me? By starving me for some human nonsense I don't even understand?" Then the mule did something that made Pietro feel even worse. He sighed. Not a dramatic sigh, not a theatrical sigh, but the deep, resigned sigh of someone who has suddenly realized that life is more complicated than they'd previously thought. Meanwhile, word of the challenge had spread through Padua faster than gossip at a church social. By mid-morning, the mule had attracted quite an audience of curious children who gathered around his pen like he was a celebrity at a book signing. "Does he look hungry yet?" asked little Matteo, pressing his face against the fence. "It's only been 3 hours," said his sister Rosa, who was 8 and therefore much more worldly. "My uncle once didn't eat for a whole day when he had the stomach flu. He said he saw dancing chickens." "Will the mule see dancing chickens?" asked Lucia, wide-eyed. The mule, overhearing this conversation, decided he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to see dancing chickens, but if they were edible dancing chickens, he might be interested. What the mule didn't know was that half the town was having theological debates about him. In the marketplace, people argued over their morning shopping. "It's cruel to starve a poor animal for a bet," said Signora Benedetta, clutching her basket of turnips. "It's not a bet, it's a test of faith," corrected her neighbor, Signor Marco, who sold candles and considered himself something of a philosopher. "Same thing," huffed Benedetta. "That poor creature doesn't understand theology. He just wants his breakfast." "Maybe that's exactly why he's the perfect judge," said a voice behind them. They turned to see St. Anthony himself, carrying a small sack of grain, not for the mule, but for the poor families on the outskirts of town. His presence immediately elevated the conversation from gossip to something approaching wisdom. "Father," Benedetta said, "surely you don't think it's right to make that innocent animal suffer for human pride?" Anthony's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Tell me, good woman, have you ever been so full that you couldn't taste your food, so distracted by abundance that you forgot to be grateful?" "Well, yes, I suppose." "Perhaps," Anthony said gently, "hunger can sometimes clear the palate for what truly nourishes, not just for mules, but for all of us." Back at the stable, the mule was discovering that being hungry made everything smell like food. The hay in his bedding suddenly seemed appetizing. The wooden fence posts looked potentially edible. Even Pietro's leather belt started to seem like it might have nutritional value. The mule was particularly fascinated by a rope hanging nearby. He approached it with the careful attention of a wine expert examining a vintage bottle. He sniffed it thoughtfully. He licked it experimentally. Finally, he took a small, tentative bite. It tasted like rope. Disappointed but not deterred, the mule decided to try a different section of rope. Perhaps this part would taste more like oats. It did not. "Oh no!" Pietro groaned, rushing over. "Not the rope! That's expensive rope!" The mule gave him an innocent look that clearly said, "Pietro, my dear boy, if you're going to starve me, you really can't expect me to make good decisions about what constitutes food. This is basic mule psychology." By afternoon, the mule had attracted even more visitors. Sir Bartolomeo himself came by to check on his investment, so to speak. He found his mule looking rather sorry for himself, standing in the middle of his pen with his head hanging down in the universal pose of someone who has been greatly wronged by the universe. "How is he?" Bartolomeo asked Pietro. "He ate 3 feet of rope, tried to chew through the fence post, and I caught him licking the stone wall," Pietro reported. "I think he's hoping the wall might taste like salt." "Did it?" "Apparently not. He made a face like he'd bitten into a lemon." Bartolomeo watched his mule, and for just a moment he felt a twinge of something that might have been guilt. But he pushed it down. This was about truth, he told himself, about showing people that they were worshiping breadcrumbs. The mule, sensing his master's presence, looked up hopefully. His expression clearly asked, "Have you come to your senses? Have you realized that this whole experiment is foolish and that oats are more important than philosophy?" "2 more days," Bartolomeo said firmly, though whether he was talking to the mule or to himself wasn't entirely clear. That evening, St. Anthony held his regular teaching in the square. Word had spread about the challenge, and the crowd was larger than usual. People wanted to hear what the saint had to say about the upcoming test. "Friends," Anthony began, his voice carrying easily across the square, "tomorrow our friend the mule will face his 2nd day of fasting. Some of you have asked me if I'm worried about the outcome." The crowd leaned forward. This was the question on everyone's mind. "Let me tell you a story," Anthony continued. "Once there was a man who was so hungry he would have eaten anything, grass, bark, even dirt. But when someone offered him a feast, he said, 'No, thank you, I'm waiting for something better.' His friends thought he was crazy. 'You're starving,' they said. 'Why would you refuse food?' And the man replied, 'Because I know the difference between what fills my stomach and what fills my soul.' A woman in the crowd called out, 'But Father, what if the mule chooses the oats? What if he's just hungry?' Anthony smiled. 'Then he'll have taught us something important about honest need.' And honesty, dear friends, is always the first step toward truth." As the crowd dispersed, many people found themselves thinking about the mule in ways they hadn't expected. Children went to bed wondering what it would be like to be that hungry. Parents found themselves grateful for full pantries. And more than a few adults found themselves asking questions they hadn't asked in years about what they were really hungry for in their own lives. Meanwhile, back in his pen, the mule was having what could only be described as philosophical thoughts. Well, as philosophical as mule thoughts can be, which mostly involved wondering why humans made everything so complicated. Day 2 dawned with the mule in a decidedly grumpier mood. He had spent the night dreaming of oats, entire fields of oats, mountains of oats, oats falling from the sky like golden rain. He woke up to the harsh reality of an empty trough and a growing awareness that his stomach was not happy with this situation. The mule's usual routine of morning stretches was interrupted by the discovery that he was weak enough to feel dizzy when he moved too quickly. This was concerning. More concerning still was the realization that he was starting to have conversations with a sparrow that had landed on his fence post. "Nice morning," the sparrow chirped. "Easy for you to say," the mule found himself thinking. "You can fly anywhere and eat whatever you want. Do you know what it's like to be stuck in a pen with nothing but philosophical implications for breakfast? The sparrow, being a sparrow, had no response to this and flew away, probably to find some nice seed somewhere, the lucky little show-off. By mid-morning, the Mule's fan club had returned in even greater numbers. Word had spread to neighboring towns, and people were making special trips to Padua just to see the famous fasting mule. "He looks thinner," observed a traveling merchant who had detoured specifically for this purpose. "His ribs are showing," added his wife, who was clearly having second thoughts about the entertainment value of watching an animal starve. "But look at his eyes," said Lucia, who had brought the mule a drawing she'd made of him looking heroic and well-fed. "They're still bright, like he knows something we don't." The mule, hearing this, tried to look wise and knowing. Mostly he just looked hungry, but he appreciated the effort to find deeper meaning in his situation. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Constanza, Sir Bartholomew's sister. She was a practical woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, and she had some thoughts about her brother's little experiment. "This is ridiculous, Bartholomew," she announced, marching up to the pen where the mule was lying down, conserving energy like the clever creature he was. "You're going to kill this poor animal to prove a point about bread." "I'm not going to kill him. It's only 3 days. People fast for longer than that." "People choose to fast," Constanza shot back. "This mule didn't volunteer for your theological experiment, and people understand why they're fasting. What does this poor creature know except that his master has suddenly decided to starve him?" The mule lifted his head and looked at Constanza with deep appreciation. Finally, someone was making sense. "Besides," Constanza continued, "what if you're wrong? What if the mule does choose the host over the oats? What then?" For the first time since making his challenge, Bartholomew looked uncertain. "That won't happen," he said, but he didn't sound as confident as he had 2 days ago. "But if it does?" Bartholomew was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I'll have to reconsider everything I thought I knew about, well, everything." The mule, despite his hunger-induced fog, found this conversation fascinating. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about him at all. He was just the messenger. The real question was whether humans could learn to recognize truth when it was right in front of them, even when it came in a package they weren't expecting. That evening, as the sun set over Padua, the mule found himself the center of an impromptu prayer vigil. Families had gathered in the square, some to pray for the mule's health, others to pray for wisdom, and still others to pray that they would recognize God's will when they saw it, whatever form it might take. Anthony joined them, not to lead the prayers, but to add his voice to theirs. And if the mule could have seen the scene from above, dozens of people kneeling in prayer around the question of what a hungry animal might choose between earthly food and divine presence, he might have realized that the miracle wasn't going to be in his choice, but in what his choice revealed about the hearts of all those watching. But the mule couldn't see from above. He could only see from his pen, where the empty trough mocked him, and tomorrow loomed like a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready for. One more day. What do you think our brave mule was dreaming about that night? And more importantly, what would you choose if you were in his hooves? Certain earthly satisfaction, or the possibility of something your heart couldn't even name but somehow knew it needed? The answer would come tomorrow, in ways no one expected. Day 3 arrived like a drum roll that had been building for 72 hours. The mule woke up and immediately regretted it, because consciousness brought with it the sharp reminder that he was very, very hungry. Not just regular hungry, but the kind of hungry that makes you consider whether tree bark might be an acceptable breakfast alternative. He had lost weight. His ribs showed like the strings of a harp, and when he stood up, he swayed slightly like a boat in gentle waters. But his eyes, his eyes were still bright and alert, as if he understood that today was going to be special, even if he wasn't entirely sure why. The town of Padua, meanwhile, was buzzing like a beehive that had just discovered caffeine. People were arriving from neighboring villages, word having spread about the great theological Mule test of 1231. Vendors set up stalls selling food, somewhat insensitively given the circumstances, and children ran through the streets chanting "Mule Day, Mule Day." In the square, preparations were underway. A beautiful wooden trough had been placed on the right side, polished until it gleamed like gold in the morning sun. Beside it sat bags of the finest oats money could buy, not the cheap stuff, but premium oats that practically glowed with nutritional promise, the kind of oats that would make any self-respecting mule weep with joy. On the left side of the square, a simple altar had been prepared. White linen, blessed candles, and a golden monstrance that would soon hold the consecrated host. It looked humble compared to the impressive display of oats, but there was something about its simplicity that made people speak more quietly when they passed by. St. Anthony arrived early, before the crowds, and spent time in prayer. Not praying for the mule to choose correctly, that would have missed the point entirely. Instead, he prayed for wisdom for everyone who'd witness what was about to happen, that they might see with their hearts as well as their eyes. Sir Bartolomeo arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept well in 3 days, which, to be fair, he hadn't. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen his mule's increasingly reproachful looks, and he'd started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd bitten off more than he could chew. But pride once unleashed is harder to rein in than a runaway horse. "How is he?" Bartolomeo asked Pietro, who had been sleeping in the stable to keep watch over the mule. "Weak but alert," Pietro reported. "He spent most of last night staring at the sky like he was having deep thoughts. Also, he tried to eat my shoe, but I think that was more desperation than philosophy." By noonday, the square was packed tighter than a jar of olives. People hung out of windows, sat on rooftops, and children perched on their fathers' shoulders for better views. The atmosphere was part carnival, part church service, and part the kind of tension you get when everyone knows something important is about to happen, but nobody knows quite what. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out the town crier, clearly enjoying his moment in history, "gather round for the most unusual test of faith our town has ever witnessed." The crowd pressed closer as 2 grooms led the mule into the square, and oh my, did he look different. 3 days without food had sharpened his features and given him an almost ethereal appearance. He walked slowly, deliberately, like an old wise man approaching a podium to deliver the speech of his lifetime. The mule's eyes took in the scene, the excited faces, the elaborate oat display, the simple altar. If he was overwhelmed by the attention, he didn't show it. Instead, he seemed to gather himself, straightening his spine and lifting his head with a dignity that made several people in the crowd wipe away sudden tears. "Before we begin," announced St. Anthony, his voice carrying easily across the square, "let us pray, not for any particular outcome, but for open hearts and clear vision." The crowd fell silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. In that silence, you could almost hear the weight of the moment settling over the square like snow. After the prayer, Anthony took his place beside the altar, while Bartolomeo positioned himself near the gleaming trough of oats. The mule stood in the center, equidistant from both options, like a furry judge preparing to render the verdict of the century. "The rules are simple," Bartolomeo called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "My mule has fasted for 3 days. On my side, the finest oats in Italy. On Father Anthony's side, his consecrated host. Whichever the mule chooses will settle our debate once and for all." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people crossed themselves, others held their breath. A few pragmatic souls quietly made small wagers, though they kept this to themselves out of respect for the sacred nature of the proceedings. Anthony lifted the monstrance, and something magical happened. The sun, which had been playing hide and seek with clouds all morning, suddenly broke through and caught the golden vessel in a beam of light so brilliant it seemed like heaven itself was providing stage lighting. The crowd gasped. The light reflected off the monstrance and scattered across the square in tiny dancing rainbows that made everyone blink and squint and marvel. But the most remarkable reaction came from the mule. He had been standing there, looking back and forth between his options like a contestant on the world's most bizarre game show. The oats were calling to him with their sweet, nutty aroma and the promise of an end to his 3-day ordeal. His stomach was practically writing love letters to those oats. But when that light hit the monstrance, something extraordinary happened. The mule went very still. His ears, which had been swiveling back and forth like furry radar dishes, locked on to the host. His large, dark eyes fixed on the golden vessel with an intensity that made the whole square hold its breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. The mule just stood there, staring, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. Then, slowly, deliberately, with a grace that would make angels weep, the mule began to move. Not toward the oats, not toward the promise of relief from his hunger, toward the altar. Step by careful step, the mule approached the host. The crowd was so quiet you could have heard a prayer drop. Children clung to their mother's skirts. Grown men found themselves holding their breath. When the mule reached the altar, he paused. For just a moment, his head turned toward the oats, and you could see the struggle in his eyes. Every fiber of his being, every instinct honed by millions of years of evolution, was screaming at him to choose the food. But then he turned back to the host, and what happened next would be talked about in Padua for generations. The mule, this humble creature, who had never been trained in theology or taught about the mysteries of faith, slowly and deliberately lowered himself to his knees. Not the way animals sometimes kneel to drink or rest, but with a solemnity and reverence that was unmistakably intentional. He bowed his great head toward the host and remained there, perfectly still, as if in worship. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes people. It was broken first by a small sob from somewhere in the crowd, then by another, and then by the sound of dozens of people sinking to their own knees. Sir Bartolomeo stood frozen beside his expensive oats, staring at his mule with an expression of complete shock. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, But he was so hungry." "Yes," said St. Anthony gently, his own voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes the deepest hunger isn't for what fills our stomachs, but for what fills our souls." And then something beautiful happened. Bartolomeo, this proud, stubborn man, who had been so certain of his skepticism, felt his knees give way, not from weakness, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that he had been asking the wrong questions all along. He knelt beside his mule, tears streaming down his face, and for the first time in years he prayed. Not the formal prayers of his childhood, but the raw, honest prayer of a man who had just realized how much he didn't know about the mysteries of faith and love and grace. The mule remained kneeling for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When he finally rose, he turned toward his master with eyes full of what could only be described as compassion, as if to say, "Don't feel bad, my friend. It took me a while to figure it out, too." The crowd erupted in cheers, tears, and prayers, all mixed together. People hugged strangers, children danced, and more than one person found themselves believing things they'd forgotten they'd ever believed. But the story doesn't end there, because after all the excitement died down, after Bartolomeo had publicly apologized and pledged to change his ways, after the crowds had gone home to tell their families about the miracle they'd witnessed, there was still the matter of one very hungry mule. "Well," said Pietro, grinning through his tears, "I suppose we should get you some of those oats now." The mule, having completed his theological duties, was more than ready to return to earthly concerns. He trotted over to the trough with considerably more energy than he'd shown all week, and began eating with the enthusiasm of someone who had earned every single bite. Between mouthfuls, he seemed to smile, as if to say, "That was quite an adventure, but let's not do it again any time soon. A mule's got to eat, you know." St. Anthony watched with delight as the mule enjoyed his well-deserved feast. "Well done, Brother Mule," he said quietly. "You've taught us all something important today." The mule looked up from his oats just long enough to bray softly, which everyone chose to interpret as, "You're welcome, and please pass the word that I'm available for other theological consultations, but only if the pay includes premium oats and no fasting requirements." From that day forward, the mule lived like the celebrity he had become. Children brought him apples and carrots. Visitors from distant towns came to see the famous miracle mule of Padua, and even the local bishop blessed him personally, though the mule seemed more interested in the bishop's ornate belt than in the blessing itself. Sir Bartolomeo kept his word. He became known throughout the region for his generosity and humility, often saying that his mule had been the better teacher of the two of them. He built a small shrine in his stable where people could come to pray and remember the day when a humble animal showed them all what faith looked like. And the mule? Well, he lived happily ever after, which for a mule means plenty of good food, comfortable shelter, gentle treatment, and the occasional opportunity to eat someone's hat if they left it unattended. But most importantly, he remained a living reminder that sometimes the greatest truths come from the most unexpected places, and that God can use anyone, even a stubborn, hungry mule, to teach us about faith, humility, and the amazing things that happen when we learn to kneel before what is truly holy. So, the moral of our story? Well, there are several. Faith often shows up in ways we don't expect. Pride can blind us to truth, while humility opens our eyes to wonder. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes the simple wisdom of a mule to show us what really matters. Oh, and always keep good oats on hand. You never know when you might need to feed a miracle. The end. What did you think of our story? Have you ever been surprised by where you found wisdom? And if you were the mule, do you think you would have had the courage to choose mystery over certainty, the unknown over the familiar? Sometimes the biggest leaps of faith come from the smallest steps, or in this case, the most humble kneel. Thanks for joining us for another Faith and Family Fable. May your own journey be filled with as much wonder, wisdom, and well-deserved oats as our friend the mule's.